Liberal education's postmodern critics. Our education is politicized, obviously. Yet my goal in this episode of Open College is to show that the politicized battles over education are mostly not about politics, but about philosophy. The policy battles over education are heated, not only because the practical stakes are high, but because they affirm or deny entire philosophies of life. Now, why philosophy? Well, consider this question. What is education's mission? What is our purpose when we are educating children? Now, as teachers, our goal is to develop within the child the knowledge, the character, skills necessary for successful living as an adult. Now, that formulation of what we're trying to do as educators takes us directly into philosophy. If education is about knowledge, well, what is knowledge? What really counts as knowledge instead of merely having an opinion or a hypothesis or a hunch? How is knowledge acquired? By observation, reasoning, mystical insights, faith, intuition? Or is knowledge actually impossible? So the philosophy branch that we call epistemology is absolutely essential to education. Epistemology, breaking it down, means episteme, and the ology, to give an account of something, is to give an account of knowledge, and particularly informed, serious knowledge. If we also say that education is about character and preparation for successful living, well, what is good character? What is successful living? Which traits, for example, are virtues and which character traits are vices? Do we want to cultivate pride and self-esteem in the children or humility? What is fairness? What counts as cheating? Do we want people to be moderate in their habits and avoid gluttony? Well, where is that line drawn? Can these things be taught? Can we really teach virtue? And if so, how? How do we teach virtue? And when we're talking about values that go into successful living, well, we start talking about love and wealth and health and wisdom. So ethics, that other important branch of philosophy, is also essential to education. If we're saying that education is about developing adult human beings, well, what does that mean? Well, what is it to be a human being in the fully developed sense? Well, we are rational, but also emotional. Our rational capacities and our emotional capacities, are they harmonious, or should they be harmonious, or are they in necessary conflict with each other? We have physical needs and physical capacities as well as psychological needs and capacities. But how do our minds and our bodies relate to each other? We are subject to biological constraints, and also we're subject to environmental conditioning. But do we also have a volitional capacity to shape our own lives, to decide what we're going to think, what we're going to believe, how we're going to feel, how we're going to act? Do we have agency, or is everything ultimately determined by forces beyond our control? So all of these philosophical questions about human nature are essential to deciding what our purposes are as educators. If education is to enable the young to leave the more protective and stylized nursery and school world and enter fully into the real world, well, what is that reality? The real world is made up of humans and other animals and technologies, and beyond that, ecosystems and climate systems and solar systems and galaxies. And beyond all of those natural systems, is there also a supernatural reality of the gods or God? So metaphysics, the branch of philosophy about what reality is all about, is also central to education. Now, many answers have been given to all of those many questions, and the ones that have been most influential on education have been those of the most influential philosophers in history. Plato, St. Augustine, Locke, Kant, and others. And in broad strokes, the history of education can be divided into three eras. The pre-modern era, prior to 1500 or so, in which a more traditional model of education dominated. Then the modernism of recent centuries, the last 500 years or so, in which liberal education's model came to dominate. And now, more recently, our postmodern era of harsh critique of both the traditional and the liberal models of education. Postmodernism fundamentally rejects modernism and pre-modernism. So let's begin our philosophical journey today into educational philosophy by contrasting modern liberal and pre-modern traditional education. In the early modern world, 1500s or so, the battles over education began as a reaction against traditional practices that were often authoritarian and very distant from practical concerns. Approved truths were taught, things that were considered to be false were censored, students dutifully listened, they repeated, and they obeyed. The modern revolution in education stressed secular practicality, independence of judgment, experience and reason, free expression and play as keys to learning. Now here's Michel de Montaigne in a 1575 piece called On the Education of Children. Quote, "If he, the student, embraces the opinions of Xenophon and Plato by his own reasoning, they will no longer be theirs but his. Who follows another follows nothing. Truth and reason are common to all men, and no more belong to the man who first uttered them than to him that repeated them after him." Now, Montaigne's claim of independence, basically, embrace these things but by your own reasoning. Don't be a follower. And the idea that truth and the capacity for reason are universal to all men, not just the prerogative of an elite few human beings. That independence claim is striking, especially in contrast to the view that following authority, whether scriptural authority or the classical texts or the established institutions, was considered proper, and that had been baked into education for a millennia. A generation later, after Montaigne, now moving from France to England, Francis Bacon proclaimed that knowledge is power, kind of an anthem rallying cry of the modern world. Bacon is modern in emphasizing the practicality of knowledge as a tool to improve life in the natural world. And this is in strong contrast to long-held views that knowledge is an end in itself, or knowledge is primarily about otherworldly things that are often irrelevant to practical concerns. We are interested in the natural world. We are interested in knowledge as a tool, as a means to an end, as moderns. A generation later, Galileo Galilei, his 1615, he published a widely circulated open letter. This is in the context of his battles with the Catholic Church over whether it's going to be legitimate, allowed to advocate for the view that the sun is at the center of the solar system. Now we call it the solar system, instead of the earth-centered or geocentric model. But in that widely circulated letter, he makes the modern claim that both science and religion are equally legitimate modes of understanding reality. But he goes on to argue that experience and reason should take precedence over faith and threats of punishment from authority figures for those who question or disbelieve. Notice that experience and reason should take precedence over faith and following authority. Quote, "I do not feel obliged to believe that the same God who has endowed us with senses, reason, and intellect has intended us to forego their use and by some other means to give us knowledge which we can attain by them." This is strikingly modern. God has given everyone senses, reason, and intellect, and they are useful and we ought to use them. A generation, now we've moved from France to England to Italy, back again to England. A generation later, we have John Milton. This is in 1644, with a blanket, very strong rejection of all forms of censorship that had obviously dominated politics and dominated education for, again, a millennia. Quote, "Though all the winds of doctrine were let loose to play upon the earth, so truth be in the field, we do injuriously by licensing and prohibiting to misdoubt her strength. Let her being truth and falsehood, grapple. Whoever knew truth to put to the worse in a free and open encounter?" So Milton is arguing that we should have open publication, open discussion by anyone and everyone on everything. And that's a strikingly modern method. And that's especially in contrast to the long-held claims that error is powerful and error is strong and it must be censored by those who know better, and that only authority-approved truths should be allowed into public circulation. The moderns are anti-censorship. Now, those trends are all of them. The points from Bacon, from Montaigne, from Milton, into a generation later, John Locke's philosophy, and in his very short treatise cast as an open letter called Some Thoughts Concerning Education. And to all of those themes, Locke adds the point that learning should be pleasure. It should be fun, and it's something that should be pursued freely. Quote, "Great care is to be taken that education be never made as a business to him," the student, "nor that he look on it as a task. We naturally, even from our cradles, love liberty, and have therefore an aversion to many things for no other reason but because they are enjoined us. I have always had a fancy that learning might be made a play and recreation to children." Now, Locke's remarks are very striking and very modern in the context of a long history of seeing education as a painful duty that must be undertaken because the authorities have decreed it so. Now, Bacon's publication in 1597, Locke in 1690, that is a revolutionary century of modern ideas displacing orthodox ones about philosophy in general, and then more specifically about the education of children. Now, in revolutions, of course, debates are polarized, risk of caricature is high. So let's look at the other side of the debate, though, beginning with the most influential philosopher of education in history. Have the moderns been correct in seeing this premodern, authoritarian, no fun, strict censorship, top-down duty approach to education as dominating? Are they accurate in reacting to that? So let's go back to Plato, who's obviously also one of the most philosophers as well as one of the most influential philosophers of education. On freedom of education, now Plato tells us the myth of Gyges. It's a very famous myth. He didn't originate it, but he made some philosophical work out of it, about a shepherd who found a magical ring that enabled him to become invisible, and then promptly uses that power of invisibility to steal, to rape, and to murder. The story's moral is that human nature tends to badness, and that human beings naturally abuse any freedoms that they have. Consequently, if this is human nature, when we're starting with young human beings, education should be about imposing discipline and using punishment to correct those powerful and natural human tendencies toward evil. What about play and pleasure in education? Well, Plato also offers this famous allegory of the cave, and in the telling of this, he has Socrates, the character in his Republic, emphasizing the language of compulsion and pain and duty. We start off with human beings or representative human beings chained in the bottom of this dark cave, seeing shadowy images on the cave wall, and they do nothing to try to free themselves, to break their chains, to ascend out of the cave. Instead, they are just ignorant learners, and they are tethered in the bottom of this dark, smelly cave. Instead, Plato goes out of his way to say that someone has to come along and compel these ignorant learners to rise. He has to force them to turn toward the light, eventually the otherworldly light, and that their ascent out of ignorance to the light, and sent out of this lowly underground world to the true reality that is above, it is painful. The entire allegory is about compulsion, about force, about rising to another world as a result of this, painfully and against one's will. Also in the Republic, Plato's got several influential arguments for censorship of literature, music, and the arts. The Platonic educator takes up the so-called, quote, ancient quarrel between philosophy and poetry, and argues for a strict censorship of poetry and the arts in all of their forms, and for the state-enforced dominance of philosophy, and of course, Platonic philosophy. Children must be exposed only to good material and protected from the bad. And yet we find in many stories from Homer, from Aristophanes and others, portrayals of the gods and heroes as immoral and ridiculous. Therefore, we must have strict censorship. Further, in a later work, in the Laws, we find a Platonic argument for the regulation of children's games in order to train them toward strict obedience to the laws. Yes, of course, children are going to play games, but it's not going to be freedom and them making up their own rules. The purpose of allowing them to play games is the idea that there are rules that have been established, and children need to learn to follow the rules. The Athenian stranger is the character in this case announcing this argument, quote, "There exists in every state a complete ignorance about children's games and how they are of decisive importance for legislation." Pausing here. Children's games are political, and they are for a political purpose, legislation, as determining whether the laws enacted are to be permanent or not. For when in the program of games it's prescribed and secures that the same children always play the same game and delight in the same toys in the same way and under the same conditions, it allows the real and serious laws to be remained undisturbed. So notice the emphasis on the sameness here. Everybody doing the same thing, the same way, at the same time, and those rules have been decided by the authority figures. That's what we are trying to do in games. It's not about freedom, experimentation, fun. Now, to the extent that Socrates and the stranger speak for Plato, this model of education follows. What we are trying to do in educating children is, 1, rule following, especially rules made by others and made in the past, and not to change things. 2, imposed discipline. 3, obedience. 4, censorship. And 5, education as a painful duty. Now, these points from Plato in the text are often phrased as questions, and they're made by the semi-fictional Socrates and other characters. Yet, educators influenced by Plato, the most influential philosopher perhaps in history, applied them more or less consistently in both religious and in secular form for 2 millennia. And that is precisely what the modern liberals were reacting against come the 1400s, 1500s, and on into the 1600s. Now, what we then have is traditional, pre-modern, more authoritarian education and a more modern liberal education. Now, that modern revolution in education did reach its intellectual maturity with representative figures like Montaigne and Bacon and Galileo and Milton and Locke in this long 17th century. So we're going from, say, the 1500s on into the early 1700s. At the revolution, though, this modern liberal revolution in education was not decisive for all of Europe, though, as there was a counter-revolution in philosophy and a counter-revolution correspondingly in education. And it was first mounted in the German states, especially in Prussia.
In his book, Entrepreneurial Living, 15 Stories of Innovation, Risk and Achievement, and 1 Story of Abject Failure, Professor Stephen Hicks has put together a series of interviews with entrepreneurs from 6 different countries and 7 US states to explore the adventure and the hard-headedness of business. In this book, Hicks explores what makes for entrepreneurial success and failure. To what extent does success depend on the key decisions, ideas, persistent action, or character traits? How does one's business life fit into one's overall life? And how does one even define success? Our belief is that we can always learn from the accomplishments and setbacks of others. The life stories from others can be informative, cautionary, and inspirational as we each strive to more fully realize our own potentials and achieve our own goals. The 16 entrepreneurs featured in this book are widespread geographically as well as in the range of their endeavors, from sports to education, to fashion to technology, to finance to advertising, to architecture, to cosmetics, and more. Observation of success and failure is often the best way to avoid pitfalls, learning from the mistakes of others to get on the pathway to success. This book doesn't disappoint, providing engaging and useful insights from the accounts of 16 entrepreneurs whose reflections are both personal to them and timeless in their significance for the rest of us. Pick up your copy of Entrepreneurial Living, 15 Stories of Innovation, Risk and Achievement, and 1 Story of Abject Failure by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com.
Now, here, another big gun, Immanuel Kant. Kant wrote about education about a century after John Locke. John Locke was publishing his notes on education in the 1690s. Immanuel Kant is lecturing on education through the 1770s, 80s, and publishing on into the 1790s. But Kant was well aware of Lockean liberal education. And Kant systematically brought his powerful intellect to bear upon attacking it systematically. Locke had emphasized children's self-motivation and the freedom to pursue their own interests in education. Kant disagreed. Children must act out of duty and not inclination. Quote from his On Education. Kant: one often hears it said that we should put everything before children in such a way that they shall do it from inclination. Now, in some cases, it's true, this is all very well, but there is much besides which we must place before them as duty. For in the paying of rates and taxes, in the work of the office, and in many other cases, we must be led not by inclination, but by duty, even though the child should not be able to see the reason of a duty. It is nevertheless better that certain things should be prescribed to him in this way. So, duties imposed, and that's preparation for a life of duty, not freedom and inclination, preparation for a life of freedom and pursuing your own idea of happiness. Locke had argued also that we as human beings begin tabula rasa, that's to say blank slate, and that we become good or bad by the choices that we make. And if children are raised properly, they can, of course, by and large, become good human beings. Now, Kant, this is a century after Locke, well into the modern world, Kant reasserts a version of original sin. Quote, "The history of freedom begins with badness, for it is man's work." So man's, when they're given freedom, go to the bad, and that's the history of freedom. bad thing after bad thing. And so we must not repeat Eve and Adam's disobedience in the Garden of Eden. Obedience. Disobedience is the great sins, and so obedience has to come first. Quote again from Kant. Above all things, and notice I'm going to pause here again because for emphasis, above all things, obedience is an essential feature in the character of a child, especially of a schoolboy or girl, unquote. Now, Kant's emphasis upon obedience was influenced by Johann Georg Sulzer, who was probably the leading education theorist in the German-speaking states. A little earlier, in 1748, Sulzer had stated his fundamental thesis about education this way, quote, obedience is so important that all education is actually nothing other than learning how to obey, unquote. So obedience versus liberty and freedom. So we're obviously not going to go down any sort of liberal education road. Education is nothing other than learning how to obey. And Sulzer goes on to elaborate. It is not very easy, however, to implant obedience in children. It is quite natural for this child's soul to want to have a will of its own. And things that are not done correctly in the first 2 years will be difficult to rectify thereafter. One of the advantages of these early years, then, is that force and compulsion can be used. Over the years, children forget everything that happened to them in early childhood. If their wills can be broken at this time, they will never remember afterwards that they had a will, unquote. Now notice this, we're all about obedience. We're all about breaking children's wills early before they're going to have long-term memory. And on the basis of doing that, then we can mold the child into the dutiful kind of being that we want. No freedom, no exploration, no doing what you want, none of this having your own will business. Now, much of Kant reads like, when he's writing about education, reads like he's glossing on Sulzer. Yet, how Kant goes on to ask, are students going to learn obedience given their natural unruliness, right? So we're naturally disobedient. We naturally want to do our own will. We don't want to follow the rules and so on. And so children are often disobedient. And here Kant goes on to argue, quote, every transgression in a child is a want of obedience, and this brings punishment with it. And then Kant then goes on to present this very long taxonomy of disobediences and corresponding punishments. So lots and lots of punishment is going to be necessary in the education of children. And again, we have a very striking contrast to the liberal approach, which was again expressed beautifully by Locke, who was very much that anti-punishment, or very light on punishment. And here is the quote. I am very apt to think that great severity of punishment does but very little good, nay, great harm in education. And holding all other things equal, those children who have been most chastised seldom make the best men, unquote. All right, so far what we have, this is at a pretty high level of abstraction, is a two-way debate between kind of a pre-modern educational system with advocates stretching across many, many centuries, from Plato to Augustine in a more religious version, to Kant, even in the modern world. And then a contrast to that pre-modern system to a modern liberal educational philosophy. It has its roots also in some ancient thinkers, but it's developed systematically in the modern world in the generations from Montaigne to Galileo to Locke. And now let's turn to the third, the more recent one, postmodernism. Postmodernism is a fundamental rejection of both the modern and the pre-modern. Consequently, it rejects both traditional authoritarian education and liberal education, and it calls for a distinct third option. Now, one postmodern element is cognitive, whether knowledge is achieved through rational or non-rational methods. But What if knowledge is just a myth and only subjective stories prevail, instead of knowledge coming from, say, scripture or from mystical insights and revelation or faith, versus the idea that we have to be rational and empirical and do our logical homework and so forth? What if there is no such thing as knowledge, either in pre-modern or modern form? It's all just subjective narratives that we tell each other. Another postmodern element is ethical. Traditionally, the argument had been, do we find objective value in this life, in the natural world, or in an afterlife, in heaven or in the beyond? But a third option is to say, what if there is no such thing as an objective value? What if there are no objective values and everything is just amoral power struggles? Another postmodern element is about human identity. What is it to be a human being? And we can have the pre-modern versus modern debate. Are individuals defined by the possession of a soul that was given to them by God, that is sacred? Or are individuals defined by their independent and autonomous choices that they make for themselves and the lives that they create for themselves? But a third option, of course, is to say that individuality is a myth. There is no soul, there's no rational nature. All of that is a myth, and we are just social constructs, as postmoderns want to argue. Another postmodern element is political. What are we trying to do? What kind of citizens or subjects are we trying, or members of the polity are we trying to create when we're taking young people and developing them to adulthood? Should education prepare one to take your proper place in some sort of hierarchy, perhaps a feudal hierarchy, to know your place and your class with your obligations and your duties? Or is it the case that we're trying to raise children to become free and self-responsible citizens in some sort of democratic republican polity? But what if we reject both hierarchy and freedom and substitute some sort of radical, very radical equality? Now, most philosophical battles are three-way battles between now the pre-moderns, the moderns, and the postmoderns, who are asserting a consistent third alternative. Now, postmodernism is a phenomenon of the latter part of the 20th century and on into the 21st century, but a number of philosophical developments over the last 2 centuries, particularly from the early 1800s, fed the rise of postmodernism. So a full story, we'd have to go back and brush up on Karl Marx's strong versus weak exploitation theory. We have to get up to speed on Friedrich Nietzsche's perspectival power politics. John Dewey, the pragmatic philosopher, with his pragmatic assimilation of the individual to the group. Martin Heidegger and the other existentialists and their emphasis on kind of emotionalized anxiety, dread, and disquiet. And here I'll make a little plug for my Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, for the intellectual history, how from Kant and Marx and Nietzsche and Dewey and Heidegger, they're laying the groundwork for the postmoderns of the latter part of the 20th century. Now, suppose we take modernism's pride in its commitment to freedom for individuals, its commitment to extending the franchise to women, members of all ethnic and racial groups, its battles against slavery, to eliminating many various arbitrary social barriers, the modern vision of free, self-responsible pursuit of happiness individuals in a democratic, republican, market-friendly society. Suppose we reject all of that, and including modernism's taking pride in what it has accomplished. Suppose we then say, from the postmodern perspective, all of that is nonsense, all of that is crap, all of that is a mask. It's not true for anybody who's not, say, a white male or ethnically Anglo-Saxon. Postmoderns want to reject modernism's universalism and substitute a kind of identity politics in its place. Here, a well-known name is Henry Giroux, who puts it this way in Philosophy Speak, a prominent philosopher of education applying postmodernism. Quote, "Within the discourse of modernity, the other not only sometimes ceases to be a historical agent, but is often defined within totalizing and universalistic theories." Now I'm going to pause there and part this. That is to say, if we look at modern philosophy, the way it talks, modern discourse, the other, that is to say, people who are different in various ways, they stop being historical agents. That is to say, they stop being seen as having their own agency or their own power. But instead, they are assimilated, defined in terms of some sort of universal stereotype, some sort of totalizing theory. Or that's what we've got so far. But what that universalizing theory is doing is, quote, "It creates a transcendental, rational, white, male, Eurocentric subject that occupies the centers of power while simultaneously appearing to exist outside time and space," unquote. So really what's going on in modern philosophy from this postmodern perspective is it's actually just taking one particular agenda, white people's agenda, or the agenda of males or Europeans who have a lot of power, and it's elevating those to some sort of pretense that they are transcendental, they represent the universe, and everybody's supposed to be rational and think the way they do and so forth for all time and space, and everybody then needs to be assimilated to that. That's what postmodernism views modern philosophy is about, and that's what it rejects. Now, against, say, modernism's claim, the modern world says, if we take free market capitalism, it's generated huge amounts of wealth for everybody. It's extended liberty and property rights. Instead, the postmoderns argue that Rousseau and Marx were correct. And these are earlier, obviously, socialist / communalistic / egalitarian / adversarial political thinkers. The postmoderns take that line of development and argue that our economic system, it's dominated by a small group of rich people at the top, and they are using society's wealth to benefit themselves at others' expense. So it's not freedom generates mutually win-win benefits for everybody. Instead, it's the powerful, in this case, the economically powerful at the top, who are ripping everybody else off and then using their power of their wealth to damage further everybody else. The moderns, modern philosophy, and its applications. They want us to believe in this good news story about innovative technologies, airplanes and x-ray machines and antibiotics and computers and so on, and how wonderful they are. But the postmoderns reject that good news story about science and technology. They will argue that high-tech military devices are just being used to exterminate and to threaten others, the powerful nations of the world. Our cars, central heating, easy air flight, they're just ruining the environment. And so technologies and other innovations, all they're doing is serving power. The modern world is self-destroying. We need to go postmodern. Many postmoderns, when we move into more cognitive issues and epistemological issues, they will claim that the moderns, when they emphasize reason and experiment and analysis, that's just one way of thinking. Perhaps white males are more proficient at those things, but we should not be requiring everybody to think like white males. Modernism's science is just another kind of intellectual imperialism, and it's eclipsing and subverting and suppressing other kinds of human knowings, right? It's plural. There are different knowings, different truths, different understandings of reality out there, and they are equally valuable. So here's a quote from Penny Strange, who's arguing against science from a postmodern feminist perspective. We need, quote, an escape from patriarchal science in which the conquest of nature is a projection of sexual dominance, unquote. Modern individualism, kind of extending universal rights to all individuals. Postmoderns are going to argue that just masks ongoing group conflict. We are not individuals. Human beings are culturally identified, culturally constructed, their economic backgrounds, their learned gender roles, racial groupings, and the shaping of their technological environments. All of those cultural factors mold and shape and constitute what it is to be a human being. So human beings are not fundamentally individuals, but rather they are dissolved by various modern social forces. And this is what, semi-postmodernist Frederick Jameson calls, quote, the death of the subject. Modernist rhetoric is about being our own selves and thinking independently, but that's just a fraud that's used to cover group conflict. Now, finally, on this philosophical survey of postmodernism, the postmoderns target modernism's emphasis on reason's objectivity and reason's competence. The claims that reason is capable of objectivity, that it is competent to figure out truths about the world, that's just another modern fraud. And here's a Michel Foucault, Foucauldian formulation, quote, it is meaningless to speak in the name of or against reason, truth, or knowledge. Reason, truth, knowledge, just meaningless words that are out there. They don't capture anything factual about the world or human capacity. So the modernist claims of reason from the postmodernist perspective have been shown to be fatally flawed. There's a huge amount of philosophical skepticism that is incorporated here, but those claims of reason have been shown to be without ground, just as earlier claims of mysticism and faith from the pre-modern era, those also were shown to be flawed and without grounding. So instead, truth, and we put truth in finger quotes or scare quotes, it's just a cynical truth. The world is just really governed by power and conflict. There's no happy ever story about progress, the one that we hear from the modernists. Instead, the world is just this ongoing, ceaseless series of zero-sum battles. It's winners versus losers. It's this group versus that group. It's a bunch of amoral power struggles, and so on, without end.
Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for his statement that God is dead, and his provocative account of master and slave moralities, and also for the fact that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis claim that Nietzsche was one of their great inspirations. Were the Nazis right to do so, or did they misappropriate Nietzsche's philosophy? Professor Stephen Hicks's concisely written book, Nietzsche and the Nazis, based on the 2006 documentary, corrects many widespread misconceptions about Nietzsche, giving a fascinating and easy-to-understand analysis of Nietzsche's work, asking and answering a number of questions, such as what were the key elements of Hitler and the National Socialist political philosophy? How did the Nazis come to power in a nation as educated and civilized as Germany? What was Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy? The philosophy of live dangerously, and that which does not kill us makes us stronger? And to what extent did Nietzsche's philosophy provide a foundation for the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis? Professor Hicks demonstrates his mastery of this subject using quotes and critical analysis that prove his points and show the true linkage between Nietzsche and the Nazis, and how philosophical ideas move the world. Get your copy of Nietzsche and the Nazis by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com today. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College podcast hosted by Hicks himself on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Now, what does this mean for education? Suppose you buy into, in a serious intellectual way, this postmodern philosophical rejection of both premodernism and modernism. Now here's Frank Lentricchia talking about his role as a professor in the classroom at university. Quote, postmodernism seeks not to find the foundation and conditions of truth. Pausing there. So we're not interested in truth. We're not interested in the foundations of truth or what conditions make discovery of truth possible. Postmodernism seeks not to find the foundation and the conditions of truth, but to exercise power for the purpose of social change. Right? We want to change society. We have a social activist, a political activist agenda, and in the classroom we are exercising power for that purpose. The postmodern world of education is a struggle for power, and all of the participants, students, teachers, and administrators, must enter into that power struggle. From Chandra Talpade Mohante, she's focusing the point upon from more of a perspective about women and third world peoples, but from her perspective, the academy and the classroom are, quote, political and cultural sites that represent accommodations and contestations over knowledge. Pausing there for a moment. So the classroom is a political site. It's a cultural site, and it's about contestations. It's about adversary. It's about battles over knowledge. Picking up the quotation again, by differentially empowered social constituencies. The teachers and students produce, reinforce, recreate, resist, and transform ideas about race, gender, and difference in the classroom. So what we've got is a bunch of different groups represented in our classrooms. They have different amounts of power. They are from different races, different genders, and so forth. And it's all one big power struggle over political control. Now, none of these competing ideas can claim truth. This is another quotation from Henri Giroux from a piece called Border Pedagogy as Postmodernist Resistance. Okay, so we're at the borders, right, or at the edges, right, and our pedagogy or our educational methods are about postmodern resistance. And so what we've done from our postmodern perspective, this is a framing point now, we've rejected premodern, more religion-friendly approaches to philosophy and education. We've rejected more modern science-friendly philosophies and approaches to education. Instead, this is what we are doing. Quote, it, that is to say, postmodern resistance, does this by refusing forms of knowledge and pedagogy wrapped in the legitimizing discourse of the sacred and the priestly. It's rejecting universal reason as a fundamental for human affairs, unquote. So the first thing we need to do as postmodern educators is reject the idea that any sort of sacred religious justification for our beliefs or any sort of universalistic scientific rationale for our beliefs is grounding them. Those are both nonsense. We set both of those aside. But what we have still is a problem in our generation as postmodernism is that the idea that somehow we're supposed to be rational and the idea that somehow white male Europeans are the heroes who've discovered all of these things that we all need to learn. Quote, the transcendental, rational, white, male, Eurocentric subject. That model is still dominating education, and it's privileging that group of people, and it's diminishing other groups. Quote, read against this Eurocentric, transcendental subject, the other is shown to lack any redeeming community traditions, collective voice, or historical weight. Unquote. All of the other voices, all of the other knowings, all of the other values are silenced. They are not taught. And this calls for a revolution, an institutional restructuring of higher education with many, many components. Now, if we again contrast to modern education and the modern liberal approach, the expectation would be that all individuals possess reason. They all can learn, regardless of gender, race, or ethnicity, and that collision of different perspectives is going to help everybody to learn. So people should, of course, read the arguments and counter-arguments and learn how to be good critical thinkers. But the postmodernists argue the mixing of dominant and minority groups in the same classes leads to the silencing of the minorities. So what we need to do is have separate academic fields and separate teaching fields for the disempowered group, women, blacks, third world peoples, and so on. And this is going to, this is now again from Mohanty, support those groups, quote, attempts to resist incorporation and appropriation by providing a space for historically silenced people to construct knowledge. These knowledges have always been fundamentally oppositional. So we need to have different knowledges, different social groupings for different groups of people so that they don't get assimilated into this modernist, liberal, science, democracy, capitalism friendly model of education. Another restructuring component is going to come from rejecting the idea that education is a pursuit of truth, and its idea that education is really about training social and political activists. Remember Franklin Tricchia saying that the postmodern educator's task is to help students, quote, spot, confront, and work against the political horrors of one's time. So the assumption here is that we live in horrible times, and our job is to teach students about all of the political horrors and how to work against them. So the educator then has to cultivate students' identification with the oppressed, with the victims, and become that's going to then enable them to become revolutionaries by the time they have grown up. These oppressed others can, now these are Giroux's words, quote, both reclaim and remake their own histories, voices, and visions as part of a wider struggle to change those material and social relations that deny radical pluralism. We need to change material and social relations. That's to say, technologies, the economy, and politics. Now, of course, if we're going to do all of this revolutionary restructuring of education, we have to focus on teacher training. Everything else in the postmodern transformation follows from first transforming the teachers into cultural workers, into political workers, into activists themselves, who in turn will transform the next generation. So we have to remake higher education primarily about teacher and activist training. And again, here we have a problem from the postmodern perspective. Most contemporary teachers, particularly in the West, are themselves, they're white, they're humanistic, they're heterosexual, they've been indoctrinated into the modern liberal project, and most of them have been conditioned either to think in terms of this modern liberal scientific project or some sort of pre-modern religion, usually Christianity or perhaps Judaism. But those teachers and teacher candidates must first become self-reflectively critical of their own identities. They have to first realize their own problematic identities, and that's only the thing that can make them more sensitive to, say, non-white, non-human-centered, non-heterosexual, non-scientific, non-Christian ways of thinking about things. As Giroux, again, more of his words, quote, this suggests that to the degree that teachers make the construction of their own voices, histories, and ideologies problematic. Pausing there. So I might be a white guy, and the first thing I need to learn is there's something problematic about being a white guy. Or I might be a woman who is a Christian. And the first thing I need to learn is that as a woman and a Christian, there's something deeply problematic about that. And I can then become self-critical, guilty, and ashamed about who I am and who I represent. Then, picking up the quotation again, then, quote, they become more attentive to otherness as a deeply political and pedagogical issue, unquote. And then the rest of education can then be recast along postmodern lines once we've got the teachers trained appropriately. All of the curriculum matters, what texts are going to be read, which ones are not going to be read, what are the speech policies going to be in the classroom on campus, what views can be expressed, which views cannot, guest speakers, whom are we going to invite, who are we going to disinvite, methods of evaluating student performance, and then of course all of our hiring policies for teachers and administrators. So we have a three-way battle that we have inherited in the long sweep of civilization: premodernism, modernism, and now postmodernism. Now, I'm an advocate of liberal education, so what are my thoughts about the future of liberal education? This is where I want to close. Educators are often thoughtful and passionate human beings, particularly in the early stages of their careers. They are very sensitive to whether a particular policy coheres or it conflicts with their philosophical commitments. Right? We're all thoughtful, passionate beings by the time we're adults. We've thought about a lot of things and we've worked out our own philosophical views. And those, of course, are central to our mission as educators. Yet typically those philosophical commitments are kind of semi-articulated in most people, or they are implicit. So one of the things that I'm trying to do in this podcast is to highlight that it is a three-way battle philosophically over education. We've looked at the pre-moderns, we've looked at the moderns, we've looked at the postmoderns, more or less as idealized type. It's also important, of course, to recognize that there are lots of variations within that broad three-way typology. So it's going to be an open question how education is going to proceed, given that policy and underlying philosophical debates are not ever likely to be settled. Chances are very good, particularly if we push for a liberal, modern, democratic, republican society, that we're going to have lots of free expression, lots of free exploration, and lots of people adopting lots of different philosophical perspectives. So that is going to be ongoing. I don't think those will be settled. I'm only going to answer then the question about how to approach liberal education in terms of my own commitments to a modern or an updated modern liberal education. There is an asymmetry of purpose in the three approaches to postmodern, or to education in general. Pre-modern education has historically tended to slip into authoritarian indoctrination. Postmodern education has not been any different with its politically correct indoctrination. So from the liberal modern perspective, the modern liberal education perspective, the great danger is that to the extent more pre-modern or postmodern models come to dominate, they are going to take us in an authoritarian direction, and that's going to short circuit even the debate over what education should be. Should it be more pre-modern, more postmodern, liberal, purely, or mixing, and so forth. So both pre-modern education and postmodern education then devolve from education in the full sense, and both typically have a history of training people who are just followers and activists for whatever their pre-modern or postmodern agenda is. For liberal education, the fundamental imperative is different. Liberal education is the education suitable for free individuals, and that requires the development of individual judgment, the capacity for self-responsible action that is obviously going to respect the rights of other people to exercise their own individual judgment and self-responsible action. All of that requires informed judgment on the many areas of challenge in life, from love and friendship to family, economics, religion, politics, and aesthetics. Free thinkers must know their own commitments and the arguments for them. But from the liberal education perspective, they also, to make those commitments, they have to understand the arguments against them, and they have to know the arguments for and against the other major positions. And so the liberal education model is much harder, and there are no shortcuts. So my view is that education standing policy has to be to insist upon true intellectual diversity in the curriculum and the faculty. Now, professors can and should have something to profess. Yet their first responsibility as professors, as teachers, as educators is to ensure that their students are in a position to assess independently what is being professed. Any self-respecting teacher, particularly on controversial issues, particularly on anything that's a new cutting-edge issue, will cover all of the major arguments. And any self-respecting education institution will ensure there is intellectual variety among its professors. Our only method of making progress on matters of controversy and discovering new knowledge is to shun all coercion, all the way from the subtle indoctrination of young minds to the outright physical intimidation of anyone's. Liberal education means liberty all the way down. So that means liberal educators must affirm, in Thomas Jefferson's words, quote, the free right to the unbounded exercise of reason and freedom of opinion.